The holographic image appeared above the United Nations assembly floor and cast a blue glow across hundreds of frightened faces. The alien stood 12 feet tall with skin that looked like living crystal. 4 eyes arranged vertically on its head stared down at the humans below. The creature seemed to glow from within, and its presence filled the entire chamber with an oppressive weight. Emperor Vaxon of the Krillian Dominion began to speak, and his words were translated into every language simultaneously. He told the gathered leaders that Earth had been chosen for annexation. The planet's resources were needed, and humanity's warlike nature threatened the peace of the galaxy. He gave them 48 hours to surrender completely. All weapons must be destroyed and all military forces disbanded. Resistance would mean total extinction. Cities would burn and oceans would boil. The very air they breathed would be stripped away. The room erupted into chaos instantly. Delegates shouted and screamed. Some wanted to surrender immediately, while others demanded they fight back. President Catherine Mills sat at the head of the American delegation with her hands trembling slightly. She looked across the room to where General Marcus Blake sat among the military observers. Blake was 53 years old with gray hair and a face marked by decades of combat. He had fought in 4 wars and survived more battles than he could count. Nothing about this alien emperor frightened him. He had seen the worst that humans could do to each other and lived through it. This creature was just another enemy making threats. He stood up and walked through the panicked crowd toward the front of the chamber. His boots made sharp sounds on the marble floor. The noise gradually died down as people noticed him approaching. There was something in the way he moved that commanded attention. He reached the stage and looked up at the hologram. Emperor Vaxon stared down at him with all 4 eyes focused like weapons. The alien asked what primitive creature dared to address him directly. Blake smiled, but there was no humor in it. He introduced himself as General Marcus Blake of the United States Marine Corps. Before they discussed surrender, he had one simple question for the Emperor. Vaxon seemed amused and asked what question a primitive warrior could possibly have. Blake asked how many of those 300 star systems had actually fought back against the Krillian Dominion. The alien's form rippled with something that might have been surprise or anger. He demanded to know what Blake meant. Blake explained it was a simple question. The Emperor showed up with his fleet and made threats and demanded surrender. But how many civilizations actually made him work for it? How many made him bleed for his conquests? How many refused to bow down without a fight? Vaxon said that information was irrelevant to the current situation. Blake disagreed completely. He said it was very relevant because it told him everything he needed to know about the Krillian Dominion. They were used to easy victories over terrified populations. They had probably never faced an enemy that truly fought back with everything they had. The general stepped closer to the holographic projection, and his voice dropped low and dangerous. He told the Emperor about an Earth saying. It was not about the size of the dog in the fight, but the size of the fight in the dog. Humanity had plenty of fight in them, and they were not going to roll over just because some alien showed up with big ships. Vaxon's crystalline form seemed to grow larger and more threatening. His voice boomed through the chamber as he repeated the ultimatum. 48 hours to surrender or face complete extinction. There would be no negotiation and no mercy. Blake looked up at the alien emperor with steady eyes and spoke clearly so everyone could hear. He made a counteroffer. Vaxon should pack up his fleet and turn around and forget he ever found Earth. Because if the Krillians came at humanity with actual violence, then they would not last 2 seconds in a real fight. The hologram flickered and died, leaving the assembly hall in complete silence. Nobody moved or spoke for several long moments. Everyone stared at Blake like he had just signed humanity's death warrant. President Mills finally found her voice and asked what he had just done. Blake turned to face her, and she saw something in his eyes that surprised her. It was not fear or doubt. It looked almost like excitement. He told her calmly that he had bought them 48 hours. Now they needed to use that time wisely and prepare for war. The president stood up slowly and looked around the chamber at all the shocked faces. She asked Blake if he truly believed humanity could win against such advanced technology. The general nodded once and said he did not know if they could win. But he knew for certain they could make the Krillians regret ever threatening Earth. Blake explained that bullies always picked on people they thought were weak. Vaxon had come here expecting Earth to surrender without a fight like all the others. He had arranged his fleet for maximum intimidation rather than actual combat effectiveness. The Emperor had made his first and possibly fatal mistake by underestimating human determination. The other military leaders began gathering around Blake, asking questions and demanding answers. He told them all to meet in the Pentagon War Room in 2 hours. They had work to do and not much time to do it. Every nation needed to bring everything they had. All secret weapons and experimental technology and untested theories. This was not the time to hold anything back. Admiral Richard Cole from the Navy asked what the plan was. Blake said the plan was simple in concept but difficult in execution. They were going to hit the Krillian fleet with everything at once. Nuclear weapons and kinetic strikes and electromagnetic pulses. They would overwhelm the alien defenses through sheer volume and ferocity. Someone asked what happened if it did not work. Blake looked at the man and said then humanity would go down fighting, and that was better than living as slaves. The general walked out of the chamber with his head high and his bow steady. Behind him, the assembly dissolved into frantic activity as every nation scrambled to prepare for the coming battle. President Mills watched him go and felt a strange mixture of terror and hope. Blake was either going to save humanity or doom them all, but at least they would face their fate on their feet rather than on their knees. She picked up her phone and began making calls. The next 48 hours would determine the future of the human race. The Pentagon War Room filled with military leaders from every nation on Earth, within 3 hours of Blake's challenge to the alien emperor. The massive table in the center displayed a holographic image of orbital space around the planet. 16 red icons represented the Krillian warships positioned beyond the moon like predators waiting to strike. Admiral Cole pointed at the largest vessel and said it was bigger than an aircraft carrier. The flagship alone measured 3 kilometers in length. Their satellites detected energy signatures that Earth science could not even classify properly. Those weapons could probably destroy entire continents with single shots. Blake studied the display carefully and said probably was not the same as certainly. He asked what they actually knew for sure about Krillian capabilities, rather than what they feared. A young woman named Lisa Monroe stepped forward from the NASA delegation. She was barely 30 years old, but had earned a reputation for creative thinking. Lisa explained that her team had been analyzing every signal and emission from the alien fleet since it arrived. The Krillians were definitely advanced beyond human technology. Their energy manipulation was centuries ahead, but something about their tactical positioning seemed strange to her trained eye. Blake asked her to explain what she meant by strange. Lisa manipulated the holographic display to highlight the fleet formation. She pointed out that the ships were arranged for visual impact rather than combat efficiency. The formation was perfectly symmetrical and aesthetically pleasing, but strategically terrible. The ships were clustered too close together, creating overlapping fields of fire that would endanger themselves. The flagship sat right in the center of the formation, completely exposed to attack. No competent military commander would arrange their forces this way before a real battle. Colonel Jake Morrison from the Air Force smiled grimly and said the Krillians were not expecting a fight. Lisa agreed completely. She believed General Blake had been right in his assessment. These aliens had never encountered serious resistance before. Most civilizations probably surrendered the moment they saw that fleet. Blake nodded slowly and asked what humanity could throw at them. The next 12 hours became the most intense planning session in human history. Every nation brought their secrets to the table. China revealed their orbital weapons platform, officially called a research station, but actually mounting 6 electromagnetic railguns. Russia disclosed their nuclear-pumped laser array, still in experimental stages, but potentially devastating. The European Union offered their quantum-locked missile guidance system that supposedly could not be jammed or intercepted. The United States contributed everything they had developed in secret. Stealth orbital drones that could approach targets undetected, kinetic bombardment satellites carrying tungsten rods, experimental plasma weapons that had never been tested in actual combat. 3 military spaceplanes officially part of a civilian program, but actually designed for orbital warfare. Admiral Cole looked at everything laid out before them and shook his head. He said even combined it was not enough. They were throwing rocks at tanks and hoping for the best. The technological gap was simply too large to overcome. Blake disagreed and said they did not need to fight fair. Lisa had confirmed the alien formation was defensive and designed to intimidate. That meant humanity could manipulate them into reacting exactly how Blake wanted. He turned to Morrison and asked how quickly they could retrofit commercial rockets with nuclear warheads. Morrison's eyes widened in shock. Using intercontinental ballistic missiles in space would violate the Outer Space Treaty. Blake cut him off and said the treaty became void the moment aliens tried to conquer Earth. He asked again how fast it could be. Done. Morrison calculated quickly and said, 6 hours if they ignored every safety protocol ever written. Blake told him to do it immediately. Then he turned to Lisa and said he needed her to hack into the Krillian communication system. Lisa looked at him like he had lost his mind. Their technology was centuries beyond human understanding. Blake said different did not mean better. The Krillians were broadcasting on electromagnetic frequencies that Earth equipment could detect. That meant there was a way in and she needed to find it. President Mills had been listening quietly from her position at the table. She asked Blake what he planned to do with all these preparations. The general looked at the holographic display showing the alien fleet, and his expression hardened into something cold and determined. He told the president he was going to start a war. More importantly, he was going to finish it in less than 2 seconds, just like he had promised the emperor. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed what that meant. Blake was not planning a defensive action or a desperate last stand. He intended to destroy the Krillian fleet completely. Someone asked if that was even possible given the technological disparity. Blake said anything was possible if you were willing to pay the price. Humanity had split the atom and created weapons of terrible power. Those weapons had evolved over decades into precision instruments of destruction. The Krillians had never faced nuclear warfare before, and that gave Earth an advantage. Lisa worked frantically at her computer station trying to crack the alien communication protocols. She muttered to herself about frequency patterns and encryption algorithms. After 6 hours of continuous effort, she suddenly sat back and laughed. The others gathered around asking what she had found. She explained that Krillian communication technology was actually remarkably simple once you understood their approach. They used sophisticated hardware but basic software. Their encryption was minimal, because they had never needed strong security. No conquered civilization had ever tried to hack their systems. Blake asked if she could broadcast a message to the flagship. Lisa said yes, but only for a few seconds before they locked her out. The general smiled and said a few seconds was all he needed. He began composing exactly what he wanted to say to Emperor Vaxon. The weapons came together faster than anyone thought possible. Chinese engineers worked alongside American technicians to prepare the railgun platform. Russian scientists collaborated with European researchers on the laser array. 63 nuclear missiles were armed and targeted at different points in the Krillian formation. Morrison reported that everything would be ready within the deadline. The missiles would launch in waves timed to arrive simultaneously, with kinetic projectiles from the Chinese platform. The quantum-locked European missiles would follow seconds later. It was overkill by any measure, but Blake insisted on overwhelming force. Admiral Cole asked what would stop the Krillians from simply destroying all the incoming weapons. Blake explained that the alien defensive systems were designed to handle threats from other advanced civilizations. They expected energy weapons and sophisticated missiles. Nobody in the galaxy still used primitive nuclear fission weapons. The Krillians would be scanning for the wrong signatures, and by the time they realized what was coming, it would be too late. Their clustered formation meant they could not maneuver without colliding. Their overlapping defensive screens would interfere with each other. Every advantage they thought they had would become a liability. Lisa finished programming the communication hack and showed Blake how to activate it. The general memorized the simple sequence and thanked her. President Mills approached him privately and asked if he was certain about this course of action. Once they attacked, there would be no going back. Blake looked at her steadily and said he had been certain from the moment Vaxon made his threats. Humanity did not kneel to anyone. They would rather die on their feet than live on their knees. The president nodded and gave her authorization for the attack. The countdown began with 24 hours remaining until the ultimatum expired. Every weapon was positioned and ready. Every system was tested and retested. Humanity held its breath, waiting for the moment that would decide their fate. Blake stood in the command center watching the displays and felt calm settle over him. This was what he had trained for his entire life. This was the moment that would define human history forever. 24 hours had passed since Emperor Vaxon delivered his ultimatum, and the Krillian fleet remained motionless in orbit, waiting for humanity's surrender. Inside the massive flagship, the Emperor lounged on his throne of liquid metal, feeling bored and confident. Victory had always come easily, and this time would be no different. He ordered a status report from his tactical officer, who confirmed the humans were silent. No military movements had been detected, and their primitive orbital infrastructure remained unchanged. The officer believed Earth was preparing to announce their surrender within the next few hours. Vaxon's crystalline form rippled with satisfaction as he told his crew that fear was the greatest weapon in the universe. These humans had looked upon Krillian might and understood they could not win. Soon they would broadcast their surrender, and another world would join the Dominion. Another officer called out that sensors were detecting unusual activity on the planet's surface. Multiple energy signatures consistent with rocket launches were appearing across several continents. Vaxon dismissed it as probably evacuation procedures. The human leaders were likely fleeing to underground bunkers where they could hide temporarily. What the Krillians did not understand was that 63 modified missiles were screaming up through Earth's atmosphere at that exact moment. Each one carried multiple nuclear warheads targeted at different points in the alien formation. Behind them came 12 railgun projectiles, fired from the Chinese orbital platform, moving at velocities that made them nearly invisible to standard sensors. Blake stood in the Pentagon Command Center watching the countdown tick towards 0. Lisa sat at her console with fingers ready on the keyboard, waiting for his signal. The general's face showed no emotion, but inside his heart pounded with anticipation. Everything depended on the next 2 minutes. He told Lisa to open the communication channel, and she executed the hack perfectly. Vaxon's throne suddenly crackled with an incoming transmission that bypassed all their security protocols. The general's face appeared before the Emperor, looking calm and almost friendly. Blake thanked the Emperor for teaching humanity an important lesson. Vaxon was too surprised to be angry and asked what possible lesson he could have taught. The general explained that power was not about having the biggest ships or the most advanced technology. Real power came from being willing to do whatever it took to survive. He thanked Vaxon again for that valuable insight and said goodbye. The transmission cut off just as Krillian sensors finally registered the incoming threats. 63 nuclear missiles had achieved orbital insertion and were spreading out across a wide attack pattern. The railgun projectiles would arrive 14 seconds before the missiles. Vaxon roared orders for evasive action and defensive screens. Return fire was authorized immediately. But the fleet's perfect formation became a death trap in seconds. Ships tried to maneuver and nearly collided with each other. Their defensive screens overlapped, creating interference patterns that weakened rather than strengthened protection. The railgun projectiles hit first, traveling at a significant fraction of light speed. They punched through shields and hulls like tissue paper. The kinetic energy alone was devastating, but the real purpose was creating chaos. The defensive formation shattered as ships scattered in panic. Then the nuclear missiles arrived, and 22 of them reached detonation range before being destroyed. 22 fusion warheads detonated simultaneously in the darkness of space. Each explosion released energy equivalent to millions of tons of conventional explosives. The light briefly rivaled the sun itself. The clustered Krillian ships had nowhere to hide from the overlapping blasts. Electromagnetic pulses cascaded through their systems, frying circuits and disrupting power flows. Hulls breached and atmosphere vented into space. Shields collapsed under the sustained assault. 6 warships simply ceased to exist, torn apart by forces they had never imagined facing. The remaining 10 ships finally began fighting back, but their response was confused and uncoordinated. Energy beams lanced down toward Earth, only to be intercepted by the Chinese railgun platform. The platform was destroyed, protecting the planet, but it had bought precious seconds for the next wave. Blake gave the order, and 20 European missiles launched from hidden silos. These were not nuclear weapons, but kinetic impactors. Telephone pole-sized rods of tungsten carbide would impact at tremendous velocity. Their quantum-locked guidance systems made them theoretically impossible to jam or redirect. The Krillian fleet was already reeling from the nuclear assault. Their formation was destroyed, and their systems were damaged. The Emperor sat on his throne in shock, watching his mighty fleet reduced to wreckage. 3 more ships died under the kinetic barrage, and 2 more were crippled beyond repair. Vaxon stared at the tactical display, unable to comprehend what had happened. In less than 90 seconds, humanity had destroyed most of his fleet. These were supposed to be primitive creatures armed with crude weapons. The entire situation was impossible. His tactical officer shouted that 3 small craft were launching from Earth and heading directly toward the flagship. Blake's voice came over the communication system again, somehow cutting through all their attempts to block it. The general reminded the Emperor that 2 seconds had passed, just like promised. Those 3 craft-carrying diplomatic teams were coming to negotiate terms for Krillian survival. Blake told Vaxon that he would want to be very polite during those negotiations. The transmission ended, leaving the Emperor alone with his defeat. On Earth, celebration erupted across every nation. People poured into streets cheering and crying with relief. They had faced extinction and won through courage and determination. But Blake did not celebrate. He watched the tactical display showing the shattered alien fleet and felt only grim satisfaction. President Mills approached him and asked if it was really over. The general shook his head and said this was just the beginning. Now came the hard part of figuring out what to do with a defeated alien empire. They could not simply let the Krillians leave and rebuild. Earth needed to secure their position permanently. Lisa was already analyzing data from the battle. She told Blake that something important had emerged from studying the Krillian response patterns. Their technology was advanced, but their tactical thinking was terrible. They had been completely unprepared for nuclear warfare or kinetic weapons. The young scientist believed this meant the Krillian Dominion had never fought a real war against an equal opponent. They conquered primitive civilizations through intimidation alone. Any species with actual military capability would have defeated them easily. Earth was not special because they were strong, but because they refused to surrender. Blake absorbed this information and began formulating a new plan. If the Krillians were really just bullies picking on weak civilizations, then their entire empire was built on bluff. That changed everything about how Earth should approach the post-war situation. They could not just defeat the Dominion, but potentially reshape the entire galactic power structure. He told his staff to prepare a complete analysis of Krillian weaknesses for the diplomatic team. The people heading up to negotiate needed to understand they were dealing from a position of strength, not weakness. Earth held all the cards now, and they needed to use that advantage wisely. The 3 spaceplanes carrying the diplomatic delegation launched on schedule. Commander Helen Price piloted the lead craft through the debris field of destroyed warships. She had landed jets on aircraft carriers in storms, but this was definitely the most surreal mission of her career. Behind her sat 5 people who 48 hours ago were living normal lives. Now they were humanity's first ambassadors to an alien empire. Karen Wright reviewed her negotiating strategy one final time. She had brokered peace deals in war zones, but never with aliens. Lieutenant Commander Paul Stevens and Sergeant Nicole Barnes checked their weapons purely as a precaution. Lisa had insisted on going along because Blake wanted their technology expert present. She stared out the window at the destroyed ships and felt both pride and horror. Humanity had proven they could fight, but at what cost? Hundreds of Krillian crew members had died in those explosions. They were the enemy, but they were still living beings. The flagship loomed ahead, damaged and listing slightly. Its crystalline hull was cracked in multiple places, with emergency repairs barely holding it together. They docked at the main airlock, and the door opened to reveal chaos inside. Krillian crew members rushed everywhere, trying to keep their ship functional. Emperor Vaxon waited in the docking bay, looking far less impressive than his holographic image. His exoskeleton was cracked, and one of his 4 eyes was completely dark. He held himself with attempted dignity, but pain showed in every movement. He greeted them coldly and asked what humanity wanted. Karen stepped forward and said they were here to discuss terms. Vaxon laughed bitterly and said there was nothing to discuss. Earth had won decisively and could simply dictate whatever demands they wanted. But Karen shook her head and explained that was not how humans operated. They had not wanted this fight and took no pleasure in the destruction they had caused. Earth simply wanted to be left alone to develop in peace. Now they needed to figure out how to ensure this situation never happened again. That would require negotiation, not dictation. The medical bay of the Krillian flagship had survived mostly intact and was quickly converted into a makeshift conference room. Karen sat across from Emperor Vaxon with Lisa and the 2 Marines flanking her position. The atmosphere was tense but no longer openly hostile. Defeat had made the Emperor more willing to listen. Karen laid out Earth's initial position clearly and firmly. All Krillian forces must withdraw from the solar system immediately. Earth demanded formal recognition as an independent sovereign world with full rights to self-defense. The Dominion would pay reparations for the Chinese orbital platform and the 312 people who died defending it. Vaxon's crystalline form darkened with anger at the mention of reparations. He asked how humans could attack his fleet and then demand compensation. Karen replied calmly that he had invaded their space and threatened genocide. The reparations were payment for an important lesson about picking fights with people who fought back. The Emperor began to argue, but Karen cut him off. She said they could waste time debating who started what, or they could focus on preventing future conflicts. Earth did not want eternal war with the Krillian Dominion. They wanted peace and mutual respect between civilizations. Vaxon studied her carefully with his remaining 3 eyes. He asked why humanity would offer peace after winning so decisively. Most conquerors would press their advantage and demand complete submission. Karen smiled slightly and explained that was exactly why Earth was different from the Dominion. Humans understood that lasting peace came from mutual benefit, not forced subjugation. Yes, they had won this battle, but they were realistic about the long-term situation. The Krillian Dominion controlled hundreds of star systems. Earth was one planet with primitive space travel. Military victory today did not guarantee security tomorrow. Lisa had been working with Krillian engineers on technical matters while Karen handled diplomacy. She discovered something fascinating about the Dominion's expansion history. The Empire had conquered over 400 worlds in 3 centuries, but avoided any civilization with serious military capability. She brought a Krillian star chart to the negotiating table and pointed out the pattern. The Dominion only attacked primitive worlds in early stages of development. Advanced civilizations were carefully avoided despite being much richer in resources. Lisa asked Vaxon directly if the Empire was really just a collection of conquered weaklings. The Emperor's form seemed to collapse slightly under the accusation. He admitted that yes, the Dominion targeted only defenseless worlds. There were millions of inhabited systems in the galaxy. Most possessed technology and weapons that would obliterate the Krillian fleet easily. The Empire survived by appearing powerful, while avoiding actual powerful opponents. Karen absorbed this revelation and saw opportunity in it. She asked Lisa how advanced Earth really was compared to the galactic average. The scientist explained that humanity was probably in the bottom quarter technologically, but their willingness to fight and die for freedom put them in the top tier psychologically. That combination made Earth unique. They were primitive enough that most empires would underestimate them, but determined enough to make conquest impossibly costly. Karen began to see the outline of a strategy that could benefit both sides. She called for a break in negotiations to consult with her team privately. In a small side room, Lisa excitedly explained her conversations with Krillian engineers. The aliens were desperate for certain technologies that Earth possessed. Medical advances in treating radiation damage, approaches to artificial intelligence that were more flexible than Krillian methods, material science discoveries that had military applications. Karen asked if Earth could trade technology for security. Lisa said absolutely. The Krillians needed what humanity had developed. More importantly, they needed Earth's reputation as fierce fighters. If the Dominion could claim they had allied with such formidable warriors, it would strengthen their position against actual galactic powers. Paul, the Marine lieutenant, asked if they could trust aliens, who had just tried to conquer them. Karen admitted trust would take time to build, but she believed mutual self-interest was a stronger foundation than trust anyway. Both sides had something the other needed, and that created basis for cooperation. They returned to the negotiating table and Karen presented a radical new proposal. Instead of simple withdrawal, Earth would join the Krillian Dominion as an equal partner, not a conquered territory. Technology and military expertise would be shared. Trade networks would be opened. Together, both civilizations would be stronger. Vaxon's remaining eyes all focused on her with laser intensity. He asked why humans would ally with those who came to destroy them. Karen explained bluntly that Earth preferred partnership to spending decades worrying about when the Krillians would return with a bigger fleet. She also suspected that Vaxon preferred this arrangement to returning home and admitting a primitive world had destroyed most of his fleet. If Earth joined willingly, then the Emperor could claim he had added the most dangerous warriors in the galaxy to the Dominion. That story was much better for his reputation. The Emperor was silent for several long minutes, considering the implications. Karen pressed her advantage by pointing out that right now he was the leader who lost to humans. But if he returned with Earth as a willing ally, he became the leader who recruited the galaxy's fiercest fighters. Which version of events would he rather tell? Vaxon asked what guarantees Earth wanted to ensure this partnership remained equal. Karen had prepared a detailed proposal. Earth would maintain complete sovereignty over their own territory. No Krillian forces could enter the solar system without explicit permission. All technology sharing would be reciprocal with nothing given freely. Most importantly, Earth demanded the right to help liberate other conquered worlds within the Dominion. Karen explained that humanity could not be part of an empire built on forced subjugation. If the Dominion wanted Earth's alliance, then it needed to transform into a voluntary federation. The Emperor protested that releasing conquered worlds would destroy everything the Krillians had built over centuries. Karen replied that the Empire was going to fall apart anyway. Word of Earth's victory would spread and inspire rebellions across hundreds of systems. The Dominion could either manage that transformation or be overwhelmed by it. Vaxon looked at his tactical officer, who reluctantly confirmed that intelligence reports already showed unrest increasing in several conquered systems. News of humanity's victory had traveled faster than anyone expected. Primitive worlds were asking themselves why they should remain under Krillian control. Lisa added technical perspective to the discussion. She explained that the Dominion had stagnated technologically because they only conquered primitive civilizations. Real advancement came from challenge and competition. A federation of free worlds working together would innovate faster than any empire. The negotiations continued for 6 hours, with both sides arguing over specific details. Karen proved to be a masterful negotiator, finding compromises that satisfied both human and Krillian concerns. Vaxon gradually warmed to the idea as he realized it offered him a path to transform defeat into strategic victory. They hammered out the framework for what would become the Galactic Federation. Earth would be the first free member, but others would be invited to join. The Krillian Dominion would officially dissolve over a 5-year transition period. Vaxon would serve as coordinator of the new federation, using his experience to guide the transformation. Paul asked what would stop the Emperor from simply rebuilding his empire once Earth let down their guard. Karen looked directly at Vaxon and said nothing would stop him except enlightened self-interest. The old model of conquest was dying, and clinging to it would doom the Krillians. The Emperor nodded slowly and said that perhaps defeat had taught him wisdom he never gained from victory. 300 years of conquest had brought the Dominion to the edge of destruction. Perhaps 300 years of cooperation would bring something better. They drafted a preliminary agreement and transmitted it to Earth for approval. President Mills read through the document with her cabinet and military advisors. Blake reviewed the security provisions and pronounced them acceptable. After intense debate, the government voted to accept the alliance. Word spread across Earth that humanity had not only survived, but had turned their would-be conquerors into allies. The response was mixed. Some celebrated the diplomatic victory, while others wanted the aliens punished more severely. But most people simply felt relief that the immediate threat had ended. Karen shook hands with Emperor Vaxon, using the human gesture that Lisa had taught him. The crystalline being's appendage felt strange and cold, but the symbolism mattered more than comfort. Two civilizations that had been enemies hours ago were now partners in reshaping galactic politics. The diplomatic team prepared to return to Earth. Lisa stayed behind temporarily to work with Krillian engineers on immediate technology exchanges. The Marines remained as security, but also as a reminder that humans were not to be threatened. Vaxon accompanied them to the airlock and spoke privately with Karen. He told her that she had accomplished something remarkable. She had taken his greatest defeat and transformed it into an opportunity for both their peoples. Karen smiled and said that was what grew. 3 months had passed since the battle that changed everything, and General Blake stood on the observation deck of Sentinel-1, watching construction crews work in the darkness of space. Human technicians worked alongside Krillian engineers, building an orbital defense network that combined both technologies. The sight filled him with cautious optimism. Emperor Vaxon approached from behind and stood beside Blake, looking out at the construction. The alien had recovered from his injuries, though the fourth eye remained dark as a permanent reminder. He had chosen to stay on Earth as the official Krillian ambassador, rather than return to his homeworld immediately. Vaxon commented that Earth was quite chaotic compared to most civilized worlds. Blake smiled and said chaos was humanity's natural state. The Emperor said he was beginning to understand why that chaos made humans such formidable opponents. Species that thrived on conflict and challenge did not surrender easily, Blake corrected him gently. Humans preferred to think of it as determination rather than chaos. Vaxon nodded and said, call it what you will. He had reviewed historical records from 300 years of Krillian expansion. Earth was the only civilization to not merely resist, but to defeat the Dominion decisively. The general asked if that made humanity uniquely violent. Vaxon said no, it made them uniquely free. Most civilizations, when faced with overwhelming force, calculated the odds and surrendered. But humans looked at impossible odds and saw them as challenges to overcome. Blake explained that Earth had many sayings about fighting against superior forces. Victory or death. Never surrender. Don't give up the ship. Those phrases captured something fundamental about human nature. They would rather die free than live as slaves. Vaxon said he had studied Earth history extensively during his time here. Thermopylae and the Alamo and Stalingrad. Time and again humans faced certain defeat and fought anyway. It was both admirable and terrifying to witness. Blake asked if that was why the Emperor agreed to the alliance. The alien admitted fear was part of his calculation. Humans who destroyed his fleet in 2 minutes were not enemies he wanted to face again. But respect played a larger role than fear. In 300 years of conquest, he had never learned anything from the worlds he conquered. Earth had taught him more in 3 months than he learned in 3 centuries. Blake asked what lessons the Emperor had learned. Vaxon explained that power without challenge led to stagnation. The Krillian Dominion had been expanding for generations but not truly advancing. They conquered primitive worlds and extracted resources and moved on. There was no growth because there was no need. But humans were different. They constantly pushed themselves to improve and innovate and overcome limitations. It was exhausting to watch but also inspiring. The Emperor gestured at the construction outside. Human and Krillian workers were accomplishing things neither species could do alone. A communication alert sounded, and Blake checked his tablet. His expression shifted to something between satisfaction and concern. He activated a holographic display showing a distant star system. A Krillian colony world had successfully rebelled and declared independence. Vaxon stared at the display with dismay visible in his crystalline form. He asked how this had happened. Blake explained that word of Earth's victory had spread through the Dominion faster than anyone could contain. Conquered worlds were asking themselves why they should remain under Krillian control. The Emperor said the Dominion was falling apart. Blake corrected him again. The Dominion was evolving into something better. Those rebelling worlds did not want to destroy the Krillians. They wanted the same thing Earth wanted, which was freedom and self-determination. Vaxon called it disaster, but Blake called it opportunity. The empire built on fear and intimidation was always going to collapse eventually. Now the Emperor had a chance to guide that collapse into something constructive, not a dominion of conquered worlds, but a federation of allied worlds. The alien asked if Earth would lead this federation. Blake laughed and said no. Leadership would be shared among all member worlds. The Krillians brought centuries of experience in space. Earth brought military strength and technological innovation. Other worlds would contribute their own unique strengths. Vaxon was silent for a long moment, processing this radical vision. He asked if Blake truly believed it could work. The general said he knew it could because the alternative was what they had before. When the Krillians came demanding surrender, they expected another easy conquest. Instead, they found a fight that nearly destroyed them. That happened because humans were not afraid of the Emperor. They were afraid of losing their freedom. Now other worlds were not afraid anymore either. Vaxon could spend decades fighting rebellions across hundreds of systems and probably lose. Or he could transform enemies into allies like Earth had done with him. Blake explained that when you came to Earth, you gave humanity 2 days to surrender or face extinction. The general had promised you would not last 2 seconds in a real fight. That prediction was accurate, but humanity won a greater victory than simple military defeat. Vaxon asked what he meant. Blake said the Krillians had been conquered more thoroughly than they ever conquered any world. Not through force, but through example. Earth showed that strength came from standing with others, not dominating them. True power was measured in courage and conviction, not warships. The Emperor acknowledged that this was the lesson Earth taught, and he was glad to learn it, though the learning had been painful. Blake said all worthwhile lessons involved some pain, but the important thing was applying those lessons going forward. Below them, Earth rotated in silent majesty. The planet that 3 months ago faced extinction was now the cornerstone of a new galactic order. Blake watched the blue world and felt cautious pride. Humanity had not just survived, but had sparked a revolution across the stars. Vaxon asked what Blake was thinking. The general said he was thinking that 3 months ago they prepared for extinction. Today they were building a future that included partnership with beings from across the galaxy. That was quite a transformation in a short time. The Emperor agreed and said it all began because one human general refused to accept the inevitable. Blake smiled and explained that humans did not believe in inevitable. They believed in possible. As long as something was possible, they would fight for it. Vaxon asked even if the odds were impossible. Blake said especially then. Impossible was just another word for challenge accepted in human thinking. The alien made a sound that might have been laughter. He said he was learning that about humans. They turned from the viewport and walked toward the command center. Representatives from a dozen former Krillian colonies waited to discuss terms of joining the new federation. Each world brought different concerns and different strengths. The negotiations would be complex and difficult. But Blake had spent his career facing impossible odds, so this was just one more challenge. The command center buzzed with activity as diplomats and military officers from multiple species worked together. It was chaotic and sometimes frustrating, but also exciting. They were building something that had never existed before, a federation based on freedom and mutual respect rather than conquest and fear. Lisa worked at a technical station coordinating technology exchanges between multiple worlds. She had discovered that each civilization had developed unique solutions to common problems. Sharing that knowledge would benefit everyone. The young scientist was in her element, facilitating communication between alien engineers. President Mills appeared on a video screen from Washington. She asked Blake for a status update on the Federation negotiations. The general reported that progress was steady, though slow. Most former colonies wanted guarantees they would not simply be trading one master for another, Blake explained. They were working to create a charter that ensured every member world maintained sovereignty while cooperating on shared challenges. It was similar to how Earth's nations had formed the United Nations. Imperfect but better than constant warfare. The president said she trusted Blake's judgment but reminded him that many humans remained suspicious of the Krillians. The general acknowledged that trust would take years to build, but starting the process now was essential. Every day of peace made future cooperation more likely. Vaxon stood before the assembled representatives and spoke about his vision for the Federation. He admitted that the Krillian Dominion had been built on a foundation of fear. That foundation was crumbling, and he would not try to rebuild it. Instead, he wanted to help create something better. Several representatives questioned whether they could trust someone who had conquered their ancestors. Vaxon did not offer excuses or apologies. He simply said that he had been defeated by Earth and learned wisdom from that defeat. If they would give him a chance, he would prove through actions that he had changed. Karen negotiated terms with each world individually addressing their specific concerns. She had learned that successful diplomacy required patience and flexibility. What worked for one civilization might not work for another. The Federation would need to accommodate that diversity. Blake watched the proceedings and thought about how far humanity had come in such a short time. 3 months ago they were isolated and vulnerable. Today they were helping to reshape galactic politics. It was almost overwhelming to consider. But he remained.